Welcome back to the Word Room. I'm so glad you're here. We are going chapter by chapter through the entire Bible, breaking down a summary of each chapter, some key takeaways, and what it tells us about God. In today's chapter, Genesis chapter 28, we see Jacob have an encounter with God that changes his life. Let's go. All right, let's jump right into Genesis chapter 28 and our summary of this chapter. In this chapter, we see that Isaac sends Jacob to marry one of Laban's daughters while fleeing from Esau. Esau hears about this and goes to try to marry one of Ishmael's daughters. And then while traveling to Laban's home, Jacob has a dream, and he dreams of a ladder reaching from heaven to earth and angels ascending and descending upon the ladder. And then we see that God blesses him and reaffirms the covenant in this dream. So let's look at some key takeaways from this chapter and see what God is saying. So Rebekah had told Jacob to flee to Laban at the end of the last chapter. We saw that at the end of the last chapter. After tricking Isaac into getting the blessing, Rebekah is worried because Esau's wanting to kill Jacob. And so Rebekah tells Jacob to flee, and Rebekah mentions that to Isaac at the end of the last chapter. So before Jacob flees, Isaac calls him to himself, shows an agreement with the plan that Jacob should flee, but then sends out Jacob with a further blessing, reaffirming that covenant, and then commands him not to marry any Canaanite women, but rather to take wives of Laban's daughters. Esau hears this command and realizes, probably for the first time, that Isaac and Rebekah don't support his marriage to his Canaanite wives. We saw a few chapters back that Esau had actually taken wives of the Canaanite women. And now he hears his parents telling Jacob, don't do that. Don't marry Canaanites. So he kind of realizes that. And in order to maybe try to regain the favor from his parents, or from his father at least, and maybe to try to get the blessing, he's like, okay, well then I will go marry one of Ishmael's daughters from the family of Abraham, not realizing, or maybe realizing and just not caring, that Ishmael is not the promised seed. So he was not the one that carried the covenant. So any of Ishmael's daughters is not going to be anything related to favor or blessing from Abraham. So Jacob has fled at this point and in the chapter, and he is alone. He's away from his family. He's running for his life. After sinning against both his father, his brother, and God, he commits this terrible sin. He's alone. He's running for his life. And even though the blessing has been given to him, even though the covenant, God has already chosen him to carry the covenant, in this circumstance, you would expect Jacob to be kind of just cut off. But in this moment, that's when God shows up to him, when he's alone, away from his family, running for his life while someone's trying to kill him. And after committing terrible sin, God shows up in that moment, almost like a picture of what God does with us, right? In our sin, in our brokenness, while we were yet sinners, Christ came and died for us. It's in that moment, in our worst moment, in our sin, that God shows up to us, which is super powerful. So the way Jacob encountered God was that he dreamed of a ladder from heaven to earth with angels coming and going, or ascending and descending between the two, between heaven and earth. It's almost as if he sees the spirit realm opened up to him, and he sees what's happening in the spirit realm. What's interesting though, and you wouldn't know it just by reading this chapter, but this is actually quoted in the Gospel of John. Jesus quotes this passage, but he does it in a different way. He flips it, which is very fascinating. In this scenario, you have the man who needs God, who's having a dream of God, or seeing in a vision, he's seeing God, and the angels are ascending and descending on a ladder. In the Gospel of John, this is what it says. Then he said, "Truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." The key to this is the context. Jesus had just called one of his disciples named Nathanael, and he calls him, and the way he identifies himself to Nathanael had been under a tree, And Jesus says, I had a vision. I saw you under that tree, even though Jesus wasn't there. Jesus, I saw you under that tree. So Jacob has a vision of God, but in the New Testament, in John 1, Jesus, who is God in the flesh, has a vision of man. It's almost like the other side of the coin. You have someone on earth, the man, seeing the vision of God, and now you have God, even though he's on earth, from the heavenly perspective, having a vision of earth, of man. And it's like the opposite mirror. But instead, Jesus says, you'll see angels of God ascending and descending, but he says that it isn't ascending and descending on a ladder, it's ascending and descending on the Son of Man, which is a title for the Messiah or Jesus. So what Jesus is saying is, truly, I am the ladder. I am the connecting point of heaven and earth. It is Jesus who connects us to heaven, and it is Jesus who connects heaven to us. Jesus is the ladder. It's an incredible picture that Jesus paints. And with that in mind, it makes this story come alive even more. So God reaffirmed his covenant with Jacob in this dream. He reaffirms that he's going to give him the land. He reaffirms that his descendants, he will have multitudes of descendants, as much as the dust of the earth. He reaffirms that all nations will be blessed through him, and he reaffirms that his presence would go with him. So all the things he promised to Abraham, all the things he promised to Isaac, he's now promising to Jacob. The covenant continues to move on generationally. Jacob responded to this and agreed to walk in the covenant. So Jacob didn't just God didn't just tell him the covenant. Jacob agrees and says, yes, I will walk in the covenant. So this tells us 5 things about God. Number 1, he meets us in our place of need. It was in one of Jacob's lowest moments. He's alone, away from his family, running for his life, sinned against his family, sinned against God. And it is in that moment that God met him. 2, he's involved in creation. We see the ladder, right? Angels ascending and descending. Jacob sees into the spirit realm and he sees that God is involved. Angels are coming and going. God is involved in creation. There is a spirit realm where God is moving. 3, he's not swayed by our works. Esau could not sway God into giving him the blessing by saying, okay, I know I married these Canaanite women, but I'll go and I'll do what Jacob is doing. I'll go marry someone from the family of Abraham. It didn't sway God's actions. God didn't give him the blessing because he did that. And in the same way, Jacob's sin didn't sway God's actions by removing the blessing from him. So it's one of those things where it's like your works, good or bad. You can't earn yourself a place with God. You can't work your way to God because your works are never going to be good enough. You also can't do something so bad that God would not reach out to you and does not pursue you and does not love you. So it's both and good and bad works do not sway God. 4, he wants to be with his people. He promises his presence to Jacob. He says, I will go with you. And then he wants to be with Jacob. He also wants to be with creation. You see this in the connecting point of the ladder, right? With Jesus. Jesus is the connecting point of heaven and earth. He wants heaven and earth to be together, and God wants to be with his people. And finally, we see this idea that he is omnipresent, that even though Jacob has fled, he's no longer with Isaac, God's there. There's nowhere that Jacob could flee that God wasn't there. His presence is everywhere. He is in all places. 5 things we learned about God. Go dig a little deeper in this chapter. Comment down below what you got out of this chapter. Like the video, share the video, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.